Good morning, and thank you very much to the whole FNMPC team for the opportunity to be part of this truly historic event. As was mentioned, I am chair of Energy for a Secure Future, an initiative with a simple goal: to create a new discussion around the future of energy in Canada and our role in delivering a secure future to the world, emissions reduction and prosperity through our energy. To accomplish this goal, we foster partnerships with Indigenous peoples, business leaders, labor leaders, mayors, and experts from across society to build a path forward with their insights. Many of our partners here today at this week's event focus on building a secure future through the development of major projects in liquefied natural gas and pipelines, electricity generation and transmission, carbon capture, hydrogen, among many others. Now you may ask, how do we define a secure future? Well, first, it is something we all want for ourselves, our families, and our friends and communities. Energy for a Secure Future recently released a paper entitled Getting Canada's Energy Future Right, a consumer lens on energy in Canada. In it, we articulate 3 components of a secure future, including strong energy fundamentals of affordability, reliability, security, and resilience, broad social acceptance, including alignment with reconciliation, and finally, the achievement of our environmental goals. Our contention is that for any major project to be successful, be it LNG mines, SMRs, or battery factories, it must address these elements. This is a tall order, but it is one in which Indigenous peoples are playing a leadership role as workers, partners, regulators, and now more than ever, as equity owners. Indigenous leaders, like FNMPC's own Chief Charlene Gale, are joining our federal ministers now in their international outreach. Leaders like Crystal Smith of Haisla and Karen Ogan of First Nations LNG Alliance are doing the same, meeting with G7 representatives and speaking at international summits like COP28 in Dubai. They are telling the world about the role Indigenous peoples are playing in delivering global energy and environmental solutions, including through LNG. It is truly an inspiring time. As many have highlighted, this month the Government of Canada announced the creation of a federal loan guarantee program for Indigenous communities. Many in this room have been part of this significant accomplishment. Valued at $5 billion, the coming program will support the equity participation of Indigenous communities in major projects. Critically, it will be sector agnostic, supporting everything from oil and gas to wind turbines and mines to infrastructure. Indigenous people will decide for themselves what projects are best for them. A federal loan guarantee is vital because it will lower borrowing costs and increase returns to participating communities. The federal borrowing rate is about 1% lower than that of provinces, and this difference will mean additional millions of dollars of benefit flowing back to Indigenous nations who access it, supporting the buildup of their economies and a more secure future for their peoples through ownership in major projects. Our speaker this morning will know that it is rare in political life to have an unmitigated success, one that all peoples of any political stripe can celebrate. What I can say today is that you have done it. And on behalf of Energy for a Secure Future and our partners, the many people in this room and across the country, I offer sincere congratulations. We look forward to today's discussion and to working together on successful implementation of this important commitment. Please join me in welcoming to the stage Mark Podlasly, Chief Sustainability Officer of FNMPC, and the Honorable Chrystia Freeland, Deputy Prime Minister and Minister of Finance.
Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome back. It is my honor to introduce our Deputy Prime Minister and Minister of Finance to our conference at FNMPC, And before I start, I just want to say, Minister, you honor all 150 of our members who are here today with your presence, and we are honored to have you come today. So, to start us off, a quick question. I'm sure as Minister of Finance and Deputy Minister, you have plenty of things to do in a day. What brings you to here with us today?
Well, it actually is my honor to be here with you, Mark, to be here with everyone in the room. I should start just by recognizing we're on the traditional territories of the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, the Anishinaabeg, and the Wendat, and in my community. So also welcome. It was a very easy decision for me to choose to be here because I think we are all here to talk about something historic for Canada, something historic as we walk on the path of reconciliation, something historic for how we get major projects done in Canada. This $5 billion Indigenous Loan Guarantee Program is a first in Canadian history. Et je suis tellement, tellement fière qu'on a fait cela, mais ce n'est pas notre gouvernement, vraiment, qui a fait cela. C'est vraiment chacun et chacune de vous qui êtes ici. C'est la communauté qui est ici qui a accompli cela. And I think I want to especially acknowledge Chief Charlene Gale and Nilo Edwards, who have worked on this for so long. Can we give them a hand? It's a really big deal, and you know, it is rare in life that you start working on something. Probably when you first started working on it, people thought it was a little impossible, and you get to the point where, as we have just heard, I think this is one thing in the budget that every single person in Canada supports. I also just want to quickly acknowledge Sarah Thomas in my office who worked on this and give a particular shout out to Cheryl Cardinal. Yeah, give her a hand, everyone. And just on a very personal note, like me, she's from the Peace Country, from Treaty 8 territory, and it means something in my life that the two of us have had the chance to work on this. So why is this so important to us all? And I'm going to just say a few quick things. One, Indigenous economic participation in the major projects that are going to build our country and our economy going forward is an essential step. I'm even going to say the essential step in building Indigenous economic prosperity and economic reconciliation. Second reason it's so important to me is I think this is going to mean our major projects are better. I really believe that Indigenous participation in these projects is going to mean we do them the right way from the start. I also am absolutely convinced, for that reason, that these projects are going to get built faster. This is an approach that is going to first and foremost advance Indigenous economic prosperity. It's going to advance prosperity for all of Canada and all Canadians. And finally, you know, we heard just in those brief opening remarks about Chief Crystal Smith. I'm going to have the honor of seeing her again later today, and the international meetings she's been having. And I think that was a really important point, because this initiative, the $5 billion Indigenous Loan Guarantee Program, it's going to do great things for Canada. It's going to do great things for Indigenous peoples in Canada. It's going to do great things for the whole world, because the world needs us to get more major projects built, to do them better, and to do them faster. And thanks to Indigenous participation, I'm really confident we're going to do that. So I'm extremely excited to be here. I'm honored to be here. And most of all, I want to thank the people who have been working on this for years and years and years. Merci beaucoup.
Thank you, Minister. So as we heard from the Minister, last Tuesday's federal budget announced the creation of an Indigenous loan guarantee program in the $5 billion range. For FNMPC members, you are right. This has been a cause for us from the beginning. It is one of the founding reasons for the creation of the FNMPC nearly a decade ago. And this access to competitively priced capital for equity investments has been a driving cause of our founding members, many of whom were in the room. And you are right, people told us we'd never get it done. So thank you from our...
Can we give them a little cheer?
Yes. So just as background for everybody, our nations, our First Nations, have historically been precluded from capital markets or accessing assets because of the colonial structures of the Indian Act. The Indian Act deems us as wards of the state, and all our assets are then held in trust by the government, which makes it very difficult for us, even though we control lands, we don't legally own them, or assets for that matter. So as you indicated, by our modeling, we know that there are billions and billions of dollars of projects waiting to happen in this country, which will be unlocked by this program. So thank you. This should see a transfer of wealth to First Nations, which is historic in the founding of Canada and the history of our country. So I would like to congratulate you again and your government for taking the biggest step towards economic reconciliation we have ever seen as a country. So having the context of what has happened last Tuesday, the history of where we are as the country, and what could be coming next, I would like to ask you a few questions. So you touched on this already about the rationale for the program. We know that why it was done. Are there any details you can give us? It's $5 billion to start. Are there any other details that you can share with us now? Because this is a hungry audience.
Sure. I'll say a couple of things. The first thing I want to emphasize, which was also mentioned in the opening remarks, is this is a sector agnostic program. That was very important personally to me. It is not for any federal government minister to choose for Indigenous peoples the projects that you want to participate in. I believe that so strongly, and that is a guiding principle of this program. We also recognize that, these are big projects. They're really challenging. The financing is challenging to sort out. It's complicated. Probably easy for Mark because he's on the board of CIBC, so maybe talk to him after. But, the financial structures are complicated, the projects themselves are complicated, and so there is also some support that's going to be delivered through NRCan to help Indigenous participants, to support them to get access to the Indigenous Loan Guarantee Program. Maybe a third thing that I'll mention quickly is we have also set up in the budget in the Privy Council office, that's like the heart of the public service, a special office to get clean energy projects done faster. And I think that there will be some really excellent collaboration between that office and some of the major projects that I hope we will see funded through the $5 billion Indigenous Loan Guarantee Program. Final thing I want to mention is I was really, really glad to hear in the opening remarks an appreciation of and an emphasis on the value of the Government of Canada being able to borrow money at a favorable rate and being able to therefore pass that favorable rate on to First Nations that want to do major projects, onto really everything in Canada. And so the final thing I'll mention, which you may not think is directly connected to the Indigenous Loan Guarantee Program, but absolutely is it was really important for me in the budget to pursue a fiscally responsible budget. I knew that we needed to make some really big investments in Canada, because right now is a time when our country is growing, and it's a time when we need to unlock the path to the middle class for Canadians, especially for young Canadians. And by the way, 20% of Indigenous people in Canada are under 15. So when we're talking about young Canadians, we're talking about a lot of Indigenous people. And we know that that requires big investments. Investments in housing, investments in affordability, investments in economic growth, like this Indigenous Loan Guarantee Program. It was really important for me, though, as I was making those massive and essential investments, to make them in a fiscally responsible way, because Canada's AAA credit rating is the underpinning for things like the $5 billion Indigenous Loan Guarantee Program. And that's why in the budget we also said we're going to ask people who are doing the very, very best in Canada to contribute a little bit more, so that we can make these essential investments while maintaining our fiscally responsible path, while maintaining our AAA credit rating, which is one of the big advantages and the big underpinnings of the Indigenous Loan Guarantee Program. It's something that the Government of Canada is now saying, we want to share that directly with every single First Nations major project. I'm so thrilled and excited that we're doing it.
Thank you. Thank you. You had mentioned a bit about this earlier, but I know 11 years ago we first met and we had a discussion about geopolitical issues, and I know that you're very interested in geopolitical risk issues now as your role in the Canadian government. So I just want to ask you, and you touched on this, the safe supply of critical minerals will be essential for us to reach net zero targets, not only in Canada but around the world. Canada has a lot of those minerals. We know that some of those minerals are going to be needed 14 times more in order to hit these targets. And we have talked about this at previous conferences. The exploration, processing, development, and shipping of those minerals will affect Indigenous lands everywhere in the country. So a question to you, how do you, from the Government of Canada's perspective, see Canada and Indigenous nations working to create a safe supply of those critical minerals to meet our demand and world demand?
Yeah, thank you very much for the question, Mark, which is a really smart and really important question. You know, in the introductory remarks, there was an allusion to the fact that many Indigenous leaders in Canada are now meeting with international leaders. And I think that's happening for two reasons. One is, I do think that this specific program that we're here to focus on, the Indigenous Loan Guarantee Program, I think we're going to see a lot of interest around the world in it. I think this is going to be transformative for how we get major projects built in Canada. And I think we're going to see a lot of other countries calling up everyone who had the idea in the first place and got it done and saying, wow, can you give us some advice? So that's one aspect of the international interest. But I think the international interest comes as well because, exactly as Mark said, now is a time when there is more attention than ever on security of supply chains for sources of traditional energy, including LNG, and also for today and looking ahead, security of the supply chains for the critical minerals and metals, which are the foundation of the energy transition. As Canadians, we're really lucky because we have a lot of those, but we have to figure out a way to mine them more effectively, to mine them in a way that Indigenous people on whose lands they are found participate, in a way that is environmentally, that meets our high environmental standards. And then we have to figure out a way to use those critical minerals and metals and get them to market. And I have to say, the world's interest in Canada being able to do that has never been higher. I was very briefly, so the budget was last Tuesday, as Mark said. Last week was also the spring meetings of the IMF World Bank, where like all the world's finance ministers get together and talk about the big issues of the day, and central bank chairman as well. And I went there really, really briefly on Thursday to attend a meeting of the Five Eyes finance ministers. That's Canada, the UK, US, Australia, and New Zealand, our closest security partners. And the specific issue, we met, it was sort of very James Bondish. We met in a secure room in the Treasury and so on, to talk about security of critical minerals and metals supply chains and sources. Because there is such a concern among our allies, and Canada has this concern too, of the vulnerability of those supply chains to countries that aren't our friends. So Canada has a huge role to play in our own security, in the security of our allies, and I think that international interest is another reason why these major projects have the potential to be a real source of prosperity and economic reconciliation for Indigenous people in Canada and for our whole country. So thank you very much.
So Minister Freeland, the audience here is an audience that, from the Indigenous side, thinks multi-generational. We have discussed that throughout the conversations today and yesterday. So I want to ask you, when you think of the future of Canada in a multi-generational sense, what do you see as our biggest challenges for our children, our grandchildren, or our greatest hopes? I'll give you both.
Okay, wow, what a beautiful question. And what an essential way to think about Canada and the world. And I must say that way of thinking was very much at the heart of this year's budget. I hope you have heard me and the Prime Minister talking about the budget as a budget which at its heart is about unlocking the promise of Canada for all Canadians with a special focus on younger generations. And with a recognition that for too many young people in Canada, that promise feels out of reach. I'm going to be, I can't quite believe I'm going to say these words, 56 this summer. Oh my goodness. So I think that moves me out of the younger generations category. I'm very much a mother and an older sister and an aunt and an older cousin. And I think about my job really from a mother's perspective. Because I think it is so important for us to be doing work that unlocks that promise of a secure, comfortable, prosperous middle-class life for every single person in Canada, with a particular focus on younger Canadians. As I said, disproportionately, Indigenous people in Canada, 25% are under 15. A lot of those younger Canadians are Indigenous people in Canada. We need to unlock the promise for them. And so I think we really need to think in those terms. I feel a bit abashed to be saying that with such enthusiasm to the group of people I see here, because you have always done that, and you've done that for many generations. So maybe I should just say I'm really honored and privileged to be having this conversation. I'm honored and privileged to be able to have been part of the work that people here have done for years. to unlock this very powerful idea, and now it's not just an idea, a reality of $5 billion going to support Indigenous participation in the major projects in our country. And that is 100%, it's 1,000% about the future of all the young people in Canada. These are projects that take a long time to get built. I hope, thanks to this loan guarantee program, thanks to the Major Projects Office in the Privy Council, thanks actually to Indigenous participation, that I think is going to mean the projects are done right first time. I hope and believe we're going to get this done faster, but all the same, these are generational projects that we're talking about. These are generational projects people around this room are building, and they're going to be the projects that create the great jobs, that create the growing economy, that create the prosperity for the children of everyone here, for our children's children, and for our children's children's children. And as Mark very correctly alluded to, even as we work to build our own prosperity, to build those jobs, to build what I really hope will be generational wealth, and not just hope, I know will be generational wealth for Indigenous people and Indigenous communities in Canada, we're going to be making Canada and the world safer. That aspect of securing supply chains for ourselves and our allies, that friendshoring, is a really important part of this too. So I think this is a very, very important moment in the history of our country. And thank you everyone for the work you've done to get us here, and thank you for the hard work it's going to take to actually put it into practice.
I have one last question for you, and this to you as a Minister of the Crown. These responses of our collective future, fantastic. It's what we've been advocating for as Indigenous people. The question I ask for you is, how do you see Canada's relationship with Canadian First Nations and the government being different for future generations than it is today?
Well, that is really at the heart of all of this, right? And again, Mark, you really should be the person leading the way on that question. I recognize my responsibility as a Minister of the Crown. And I do actually want to take a moment. I've talked about a lot of the people who got us to be here today. One person who I do want to mention is also our Prime Minister, Justin Trudeau. He said, we met just before the election campaign when he was still, I don't think he was even yet leader of the Liberal Party. And you know, I was elected when he was leader of the third party in Parliament. And starting then, he said that reconciliation needed to be at the center of everything we did, and that building a nation-to-nation relationship was absolutely essential. And you started at the beginning, talking about the legacy of colonialism, the legal discrimination, which not just made it hard, but foreclosed Indigenous participation in major projects. We need to dismantle all of that. I think it starts with a nation-to-nation relationship. And maybe I'll conclude where we began by thanking all the people in this room who worked so hard on this idea of an Indigenous loan guarantee program. And, you know, I do want to remind us all, you know, think back in time. There were people who thought that this was not necessary, that this wasn't possible. And it wasn't, this is not something that the federal government did or has done. This is something that Indigenous people understood was necessary, came up with a plan, worked really, really hard to advocate for that plan. And, you know, you did this. Thank you very, very much. I really believe that this is going to be a very important step on the path of economic reconciliation. And also just a really important step in building economic growth and prosperity for Canada. Et je veux juste finir en disant encore une fois un grand merci. Je suis tellement reconnaissante de tout le travail que les gens qui sont ici ont fait, les leaders qui sont ici. Je sais que c'était difficile. Je sais que au début, les gens ne pensaient pas que ce sera possible. Mais vous avez réussi et je suis très contente de pouvoir vous accompagner. Thank you very much. Merci beaucoup, Miigwech.
Merci. On behalf of my First Nation, in the language of our people, Cooks-Chem, which is thank you, I say thank you to you. And I believe I express the gratitude of all of our members. Thank you very much for your advocacy and your support and your words today. Thank you.
Okay, well, my pleasure. And I just want to say, now let's get some projects built. Yes. That's what I'm really excited about.
Before we leave the stage, I'm going to ask if you would mind waiting for the members of the First Nations Major Projects Coalition to come up and have a photograph with you.
I would love that.
Okay.
Okay, good afternoon, everyone. I'd like to start by acknowledging that we're gathered on the traditional territories of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples. Today's event is about ensuring Indigenous peoples, wherever they live, are able to share in Canada's prosperity. This event is about building the supportive infrastructure and housing needed for Indigenous families and communities to live longer, healthier lives. Aujourd'hui, nous sommes ici pour parler d'équité. Ce que nous faisons aujourd'hui, c'est pour donner une chance équitable à chaque génération. Nous agissons avec résolution pour aider à construire plus de logements plus rapidement. Nous agissons pour réduire le coût de la vie. Et nous favorisons le type de croissance économique qui permettra à toutes les générations de Canadiennes et de Canadiens de réaliser leur plein potentiel. Ce qui comprend la création des outils nécessaires pour que toutes les générations autochtones puissent réussir, et ce, comme elles l'entendent. La réconciliation économique fait absolument partie de cette démarche. In 2015, our government made a commitment to chart a new path of reconciliation based on the recognition of rights, respect, and partnership. We have been delivering on that commitment. In fact, since 2015, our government has invested approximately $200 billion in support for Indigenous peoples. But in order to deliver fully on this commitment, it's crucial that Indigenous communities can share in the benefits of major projects carried out in their territories and on their own terms. Unfortunately, Indigenous groups today often lack the capital to make major investments. That's a legacy of the discriminatory laws and colonialism that have stained our country's history. That's why, in the budget I tabled last week, we delivered on our commitment to create an Indigenous loan guarantee program. This program will help facilitate Indigenous equity ownership in major projects in the natural resource and energy sectors and ensure Indigenous peoples can fully participate in the Canadian economy. The program will provide up to $5 billion in loan guarantees to Indigenous communities and will support natural resource and energy projects across the country by unlocking access to affordable capital for Indigenous governments and communities seeking ownership stakes, supporting their economic development priorities, and creating new economic opportunities. Through the program, successful applicants will be able to access loans from financial institutions at lower interest rates. The budget also provides $16.5 million over 2 years to Natural Resources Canada, including $3.5 million over 2 years to support capacity funding for Indigenous communities. This investment will help Indigenous communities apply for the program and support its delivery. The Indigenous Loan Guarantee Program is a very important step for Indigenous self-determination and on Canada's path of reconciliation with Indigenous peoples. And as Finance Minister, I also know this is an important step for Canada's economic growth and prosperity. A fair future for Indigenous peoples also requires better housing, education, and healthcare. That's why, in addition to the Indigenous Loan Guarantee Program, our government is investing $2.4 billion in Indigenous communities through our 2024 budget. This includes a $918 million investment to build more safe and affordable homes faster, address overcrowding, and help more Indigenous communities to grow and prosper. We're also investing in the next generation of Indigenous post-secondary students with a $242.7 million investment through the Post-Secondary Student Support Program. We're providing nearly $1.2 billion in new funding for First Nations kindergarten to grade 12 education programming and infrastructure to create healthy learning environments for First Nations students. Et nous investissons dans la santé mentale. Nous investissons 630,2 millions de dollars pour faciliter les accès des populations autochtones aux services de santé mentale, y compris avec des stratégies de bien-être mental fondées sur la distinction. Nous nous appuyons sur les investissements tournés vers l'avenir que notre gouvernement a fait. Et nous continuons à en faire encore plus parce que nous savons que c'est un élément essentiel pour l'avenir économique du Canada. Aujourd'hui, nous nous tournons vers nos jeunes générations et vers ceux qui se soucient d'elles pour leur dire « Nous mettons toute la capacité du gouvernement à votre service. Ensemble, nous allons ouvrir la porte de la classe moyenne à plus de Canadiennes et de Canadiens et renouveler la promesse de notre merveilleux pays. » Merci beaucoup. Thank you. I'll be happy to answer your questions.
Okay, we'll now start the Q&A portion. It'll be one question, one follow-up. Just state your name and your outlet. There's a microphone over there for journalists interested. Nous passons maintenant à la période des questions. Ce sera une question suivie. Veuillez noter votre nom et votre média. Il y a un micro juste là-bas pour ceux qui sont intéressés.
Hello, Minister. Ian Bickus with the Canadian Press. Thanks for taking your questions. A lot of the talk of the Indigenous loan guarantees to help fund projects, but many, including Mark Carney this morning, talked about the importance of the green taxonomy to help also draw more investment from major international players as well. I'm curious kind of what the delay is and when can we expect progress on the green taxonomy?
Okay, yeah, thank you very much for the question. We, federal government and many partners have been doing a lot of really important work on the taxonomy. The building blocks are all there, and we're working hard to complete the process as quickly as possible.
Okay, and then the Canadian Medical Association has called for kind of an exemption to reconsider the capital gains tax. Curious your sense of whether doctors should be exempt given they save for retirement using the corporation structure, and your sense or your response to their calls for that.
Yeah, thank you for the question. I think it's important in answer to that question to start by talking about what it is our budget has set out to accomplish. And what our budget has set out to accomplish is to unlock the promise of Canada, to unlock a path to a safe, secure, comfortable middle-class life for all Canadians, particularly the young Canadians who today feel that that is out of reach. The budget does that with historic investments in housing, with investments in affordability. And by the way, those investments in affordability include significant investments in housing, with investments in economic growth, like the Indigenous Loan Guarantee Program we've been focusing on today. We know that Canada urgently needs these investments. We've seen in the budgets of provinces from BC on the center left to Ontario and Quebec on the center right, a recognition our country needs significant investment. That is what our government believes as well, and that is what we are absolutely doing with a real sense of urgency. And we also know we need to make those investments in a fiscally responsible way. And one of the things that we heard today was that part of the value of the Indigenous Loan Guarantee Program is the low rate at which the federal government is able to borrow money. That's because we are running a fiscally responsible federal economic policy, maintaining Canada's AAA rating. So we need to make really massive investments to make a middle-class life possible for Canadians, especially young Canadians. We need to do it in a fiscally responsible way. And that means it is absolutely appropriate to ask those who are doing really the very best in our society to contribute a little bit more. And that really is about investing in Canada and Canadians, making that path to a middle class open for everyone, especially for young Canadians, and doing it in a way that is fair. Because, you know, right now, prior to our budget, we had a tax system in Canada where a nurse, a carpenter, could be paying tax at a higher marginal rate than a multimillionaire. That's not fair. It is fair to ask those who are doing really well to contribute a little bit more. And I'll just remind people that when it comes to capital gains, the principal residence exemption for everyone remains in place. No capital gains at all is paid for people with their principal residence. That's important because a family's home is the main asset for the vast majority of Canadians. And I think it's also important to remember that this is a measure that is really focused on those at the very, very top. We've introduced a tier, so you only start paying more as an individual after the first $250,000 of capital gains. For a couple, that's $500,000 of capital gains before you're being asked to pay a little bit more. And then just finally, because it was a question on healthcare, you know, we recognize Canada and Canadians need significant investments today that really a huge focus of ours is on housing. I've been across the country from coast to coast to coast, and I spend time here in the city. I represent Toronto. I have not met a single person who does not agree that we need to get more homes built faster. The federal government has to invest in that. Our investments also include major investments in healthcare. In last year's budget, we put in place a $200 billion multi-year federal investment in healthcare. In this budget, we are moving ahead with investments in dental care, with investments in making contraceptives and diabetes medications free for Canadians. Those are investments in healthcare. We are forgiving loans of doctors and nurses who are prepared to work in rural communities, and we're moving aggressively ahead with recognizing the credentials of people who come here who are skilled medical professionals, making it possible for them to work in our healthcare system. So I think that these investments in our healthcare system are absolutely essential. I think Canada's healthcare professionals recognize, maybe more than anyone else, how important these investments are. They are massive, and I think it's entirely appropriate. It's really fair to ask those who are doing the best in our society to pay a little bit more to fund them. Thanks.
Next question. Prochaine question.
Hi there, Thomas Steele from Bloomberg. About the capital gains tax, the budget books a big sum of money this year, nearly $7 billion from that raise due to pull forward revenue. That's only 2 months away, so it's quite a tight deadline. Do you expect that's enough time for people and companies to be selling billions of dollars worth of assets?
I have huge respect for the professional public servants, the professional economists at the Department of Finance. When they book revenue, they do it really carefully and really professionally. I have a lot of confidence in their estimates.
Okay, thank you. And for, on the budget, the tax credit for electric vehicles, was that part of the discussions with the car maker that we've reported and others have reported?
Are you referring to the ITC?
The EV tax credits, I'm not sure.
Okay.
Sorry, which is part of the Honda discussions, basically, due to, if Doug Ford is to be believed, being announced this week.
Okay, I think you probably are referring to the ITCs, and so I'm going to go with that because it's an important issue and worth talking about. We did, in the budget, introduce one further ITC, one further investment tax credit for the full EV supply chain. That's because we believe that Canada is uniquely positioned to be a country that builds the full supply chain for the production of electric vehicles. And actually, some of that was discussed today at this event, where we talked about how critical minerals and metals are an area where we can see this Indigenous loan guarantee really playing a major role. That is part of the EV supply chain, and Canada is incredibly well positioned because we have the resources underground, we have the brains and the skills to mine and process those resources, and we are a strong manufacturer, so we can then take those resources and turn them into so many things, including electric vehicles. The EV ITC is a recognition of that and an encouragement of that, because we want to build it all here. And our partners, by the way, like the security of Canada being able to do that, the supply chain resilience that we offer. Our suite of ITCs are a major investment in and a driver of Canadian growth and prosperity. In the budget, we tallied them all up and calculated that this is around $93 billion worth of investments in Canadian growth and productivity in the transition. And it's already working. In 2023, in the first 3 quarters of that year, Canada per capita attracted the most foreign direct investment of any G7 country. When it comes to the total quantum, Canada was third. Total quantum, we were third in the G20. And those countries are much more populous than we are. So we are already a real magnet for foreign direct investment. We believe that the suite of ITCs, which we have now put forward, are going to attract even more foreign direct investment in Canada. We saw a major investment, which we announced at the end of last year, a major investment by Dow in Alberta, just outside Edmonton. We think there are going to be many, many more at that scale, and also a number of middle-sized investments because the ITCs are off the shelf. So I'm very, very excited about that. When the US passed the IRA, they transformed the global investment landscape. And so far, Canada is the only country in the world which is giving the US a run for its money. We are the only country which is competitive when it comes to attracting investment in that space. That is really, really important. I'm really glad that we're doing it. The first 2 investment tax credits should be passed into law within the next few weeks. I am impatient for that process to be finalized, and I'm going to take the opportunity of your question to say now is time for the Conservatives to stop their dilatory delay tactics. These investments should not be a partisan issue. Every single member of Parliament in Canada should want more investment in our economy. Passing these ITCs into law will further turbocharge a process that is going well. Thanks.
Next question. Prochaine question.
Hi, I'm Divya from Reuters. Mr. Freeland, you mentioned in the previous session that the Five Eyes met last week to discuss about the critical mineral supply chain. Can you share what was the outcome of the meeting? Are you looking at some sort of a customs duty on the whole issue of dumping and price manipulation that's happening in metals such as nickel, for example?
Yeah, thank you for the question. We had a previous meeting which I chaired. This meeting was chaired by Jeremy Hunt, the British Chancellor of the Exchequer, and we will have more meetings. We find it's a very good group. As Five Eyes, we're able to speak very candidly about the security threats. You know, we have a security relationship that allows us to share information. The Chancellor put out a statement after that meeting, which I will direct you towards. I think and I put out a statement too. What I would maybe add and underscore is we and our allies, in the wake of the Russian invasion, the illegal Russian invasion of Ukraine, have recognized much more than previously the vulnerability of our economies, the vulnerability of our supply chains to malign foreign actors. And we recognize that part of economic security needs to be part of national security, and we really need to think going forward about how to ensure that our supply chains are resilient. Friendshoring is part of that. Critical minerals and metals play such an essential role in the energy transition, in the production of things like electric vehicles, that we need to pay real attention to the resilience of our supply chains in that area. And I think it would be fair Canada certainly believes, and I think many of our allies do as well, where we can build our supply chains through the economies of our allies, that is going to add a lot to our resilience.
Right. Just one more question related to the budget. We see some of the junior exploration mining companies who've raised issue about how the capital gains will impact the flow-through shares. So is there any amendment coming up on those side? Will you kind of have a carve-out announcement coming up?
Yeah, thank you for the question. Our government recognizes the historic importance of mining to the Canadian economy, and that mining is more important today than ever. We put forward, we think, before any other country, a critical minerals and metals strategy. That is a measure of our focus on the sector. The investment tax credits that we were discussing earlier today are a further sign of the importance that we attach to the mining sector and of the investments that we're making, the measures we're putting in place to drive more investment into that sector. We think that is the right thing to do. We think it is foundational for other investments in the Canadian economy, and we see from our allies a real enthusiasm in seeing further Canadian strength in this area of traditional strength. We're always in conversation with the mining sector, and that will continue.
Next question. Prochaine question.
Hi, Mateo Similero, National Observer in Corporate Knights. So you just announced kind of this historic Indigenous Loan Guarantee Program, as you called it. I'm just really curious about your future vision of the program, particularly, in my conversations with leadership, Indigenous leadership, as probably your conversations as well. $5 billion, for this many nations, not to mention Métis and Inuit, it's not that much. And then on top of that, the $16.5 million for capacity building as well. So I'm just curious about your future vision, if we could see that number rising as we move forward, and whether or not you think that the provinces will begin to follow suit as well.
Great question. I would say $5 billion is just a start. I would like to see programs announced using the Indigenous Loan Guarantee very, very quickly. Nothing would make me happier than seeing that $5 billion oversubscribed and needing to put in place even more. That would be success. And there is a lot of enthusiasm from Indigenous communities, Indigenous leaders in Canada. I'm grateful for your question because it gives me a chance to say to them, we share that enthusiasm, and we hope that this program will, begin funding actual projects as quickly as possible. It is absolutely just a start.
Okay, perfect. Thank you so much. And you mentioned, obviously it's sector agnostic, the program. I'm just wondering if there's going to be any parameters or priorities in terms of what those industry partnerships look like. So, for example, is there going to be a bit more parameters on mega projects maybe run by companies like Suncor, Imperial Oil, or is there going to be any priorities for kind of the smaller projects, maybe a smaller scale clean energy projects? So I'm just wondering how you're going to balance the kind of real capital needs of mega projects with maybe the necessary smaller projects in terms of that balancing act of $5 billion.
Yeah, thank you for the question. And in the session earlier today, one of the things that was important for me to emphasize is that the Indigenous Loan Guarantee Program is really the brainchild of far-sighted Indigenous leaders in Canada. This is something Indigenous leaders saw some time ago was an important step to take, and they have been really working so hard on coming up with a vision and on working hard to get that vision put in place. It was important for us as a government to listen to Indigenous leaders as we implemented that vision. I think you heard from speakers at the conference today. I certainly did hear from them publicly, what we heard from them as we were putting the details of the program in place, that it was important to them that the program be sector agnostic, that this be led by Indigenous leaders and Indigenous communities, choosing where they want to participate. I think that's a very important principle, and that is one our government is committed to honoring.
Thank you.
We'll have time for one last question. Une dernière question.
Niall McGee with the Globe and Mail. Wanted to ask you about something I've covered a fair bit recently, the nickel market. And Mr. Wilkinson talked recently about his fears that the Chinese are essentially manipulating the market, and a lot of Canadian companies have kind of been hurt because the nickel price has fallen a lot, and the Chinese and the Indonesians have so much more control. Just wanted to know if, in your discussions with your Five Eyes colleagues or just the government's own thinking, is Canada willing to do anything to sort of fight back against this nickel price market manipulation, or at least increased control over China that's sort of hurting the Canadian industry?
That is a great question. And I have discussed a few times now, specifically with the Australian Finance Minister, nickel specifically. More broadly, we have discussed in various settings with our allies the broader challenge that you're alluding to, which is the practice of the market in nickel. It's happened in rare earths. It's happened in other commodities. The market being flooded, which then makes uneconomic the companies operating in Canada, in Australia, in market democracies. And it is our belief that that behavior can be intentional, can be happening with the purpose of driving companies in our country, in those of our allies, out of business. That is not good for our economies. It's not good for our national security. So Canada is very actively working both domestically on what we can do, and perhaps even more importantly, working energetically with our democratic partners to discuss collective responses.
Right, okay. So collective response with the allies, would that mean a collective US, Australia, UK, et cetera, Five Eyes move tariffs against China/Indonesia? Is that something people are batting around as, hey, let's have a look at this. What do you think, guys? Is this an option? Is that something that's come up?
I think it's not appropriate on an issue that is so serious and involves collaboration with allies for me to brainstorm in public about it. But let me just say, Canada recognizes this is an issue. A number of our allies, maybe I would say all of our democratic allies, recognize that this is an issue. We are having a productive conversation. We are, in Canada, looking very carefully at ways that we can act as a country to defend our national economic interest. I think economic security is national security. And we are working really constructively, productively with our allies on ways that we might be able to act collectively as well.
Thanks.
All right, that concludes today's press conference. C'est ma fin de la conférence de presse. Merci.
It's on the loan program.
Oh, sorry, it's in a press conference. I'm so sorry.
I'm already late for my meetings. I'm really sorry. I'm really, really sorry, guys. Thank you everyone for coming.